Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Betsy Popken, the Executive Director of the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley. Before we get started, I want to thank our co-sponsors for today's event, the Miller Institute and the International Human Rights Law Clinic at Berkeley Law, the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the UN Association of the East Bay. I'm so lucky to be joined here today by these friends, Noura Aljizawi, Hosam Hafez, Hind Kabawat, and Mark Ward. Noura is currently a senior researcher at Citizen Lab. Hosam is a director at QCM, Law, Politics, and Society, and Hind is the president of Tostico and the director of Interfaith Peacebuilding at George Mason University. All three of them were members of the Syrian Opposition negotiation team, trying to bring peace to the people of Syria. I was fortunate enough to support their efforts for a number of years in Geneva, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and beyond when working for the Public International Law and Policy Group. Today, we'll discuss their experiences in peace talks and hear from them lessons they learned during that time. Our hope is that these lessons will help future peace negotiators, both in Syria, but also in other places around the world, like Ukraine. I'd also like to introduce Mark Ward. Mark had a distinguished career in the US Foreign Service and at the UN, but I'll focus on his work for Syria. Mark was the director of the Syria Transition Assistance and Response Team, START, at the US State Department, which was based in Gaziantep at the Syrian border and was responsible for coordinating all overt US assistance to Syria from Turkey. He also served as the US representative in talks with Russia to enable humanitarian aid and a ceasefire in Syria. Mark will discuss more about his work and ask a question later in the program. Welcome, Noura, Hosam, and Hind. We'll begin our discussion. So the audience knows I'll be asking the same question of each of our guests, taking us from before the conflict began in March 2011 to where we are now. To start, Noura, can you please describe your experience in Syria before the conflict started in March 2011?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and for giving me the floor to go first. Usually you sacrifice the youngest person in the room. 2011, before March 15th, for me, for young Noura back then, it was just I think, similar to the experiences of many youth from my generation in Syria. We were living on daily basis, confronting the impact of living under authoritarian regime, that these facts couldn't be overlooked. I was a master's student at the University of Homs, what they called Ba'ath, after the Ba'ath party. And seeing the policing and the censorship everywhere on campus was something couldn't be overlooked. I believe, similar to many youth from my generation back then, all what I was planning to, because we tried a couple of times to break the silence and to talk about the human rights violations. We had very limited access to the word because also the internet was not that much accessible and it was censored. So not everybody was aware of the available resources or the International Human Rights Organization's report about the atrocity in Syria before we were born. And also speaking about the authoritarianism and policing on campus and elsewhere, it was something very tough. For me personally, I experienced 2 times detention because of speaking on campus. And also I was one of the bloggers that arrested in 2006 just for expressing my opinion. I was naive to assume that I was blogging anonymously, but unfortunately I ended up realizing the fact that there's no anonymity in such a country. And yeah, unfortunately, with very limited access to resources on cybersecurity and digital privacy tools, we were not enjoying even the very limited access to the internet and information. It was not available to us. I grew up asking a lot of questions about political detainees, about the repression, about why we can't speak, why we don't have a rule of law. So yeah, shortly, this is my life as a 20-year-old girl back then.
Hosam, can you tell us more about your life in post or pre-March 2011 Syria?
All right. Thank you very much, Betsy, for having me for this opportunity. Before the revolution, I was a Syrian diplomat. And before that, I was a lawyer in Damascus. I graduated like 30 years ago. I had my master's and my doctorate. And then I practiced law a little bit for like 5-6 years, and I joined the diplomatic corps in Syria. I served in various capacities in the Syrian Foreign Ministry and in Tehran, London, and Armenia. When I left diplomacy, I held a rank of diplomatic counselor, and I participated in negotiations with the foreign ministry at the time, with the Syrian European Partnership Agreement and several legal cases involving Syria, and with the Syrian border demarcation negotiations. I left the diplomatic post and I declared my defection in 2012. Since then, I've worked as part-time in different capacities with the institutions of the Syrian revolution and opposition forces. Currently, I'm working as in the legal world, in the law consultancy and negotiation training. Before, when I was in the ministry, we had this vision of, or we believe that the state is something different from the regime. The state institutions, the state civil service is not identical to the regime, and that's why we had to take action. Many of like me, my fellow civil servants, diplomats, and statesmen. So when the revolution erupted, we left our positions and we joined the revolution and the opposition institutions.
Thank you, Hosam, for sharing your story. And Hind, what about you? What was your experience in Syria before March 2011?
First, thank you so much for including me, and thank you for being with this amazing team here, like Hosam, Noura, Betsy, and Mark. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you again. So, since I'm the oldest one here, they called us the silent generation because we were young when we witnessed Hamas massacres, and we weren't allowed to speak a lot, not to speak at all sometimes. But I'm a lawyer, and I was an international counsel at a law firm in Toronto. I completed my study in Fletcher School and diplomacy, and I obtained my master from there. Went to Harvard and got my negotiation courses, and also I was visiting scholars at program negotiation at Harvard. So I was in my firm, I was part of the international negotiation team dealing with investment and international business. So then I got assigned for my firm to work for them in the Middle East, covering Dubai, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And I was based in Damascus because where all my family members are. So this has given me the chance, not only when being assigned there to work with my law firm, but also I was teaching negotiation in private institutes and doing workshop also I did some few workshops for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs back then. So I got my interest grow in interface and social dialogue after I attended World Economic Forum in Davos. And then I joined George Mason University back then in 2006 as a researcher in the subject, where I continue to work there until now as a professor and director. So I did plan lots of events in Syria and I brought lots of different religious leaders together with the civil society activists, women group, and to have this difficult conversation, we call it by then. So I realized the importance of bringing diverse group together, and I start something called the culture of debate with my colleagues. Meanwhile, I appointed officially to be member of the advisory board for the Ministry of Expatriate in Syria. All this finished in 2011 in May. And if I can have later a chance to tell you about my experience, then I will love to share it with you. Thank you.
So interesting to see how each of you had such different experiences in Syria before March 2011. So thank you for sharing that. Noura, back to you. Can you tell us what it was like after the conflict started, but before you joined the negotiation team?
Yeah, shortly I can describe that as a newborn to me. It was the time, the first time I went to Syria to protest. It was in March 25th in Homs, my city. I always describe that like the first few moments I know that I can speak, I have voice, but I couldn't hear my voice because breaking the silence was not an easy job. But joining the crowds and joining the demands of our people and meeting our dreams in the street, it was the moment that I was really born back then. Our demands were like very simple, very legit, very straightforward: freedom, democracy, rule of law, justice. Yeah, I joined the crowd at that day, and since then I joined so many groups. I became one of the nonviolent organizers on the ground, organizing protests and communication between the different coordination groups in not only in my city but also across the country. I organize students' movements, and we work with so many academics on different in different universities on different campuses. And on the other hand, because unfortunately the regime revoked the license of international and independent journalists, so we had to step in and to take the role of being also the eyes of the world on the ground. So I established a group of like networks, independent networks. I trained so many citizen journalists, and also I was the co-founder of one of the first independent newspapers in Syria. We called it Hurriyat, means freedoms. So we were working on all of these fronts on daily basis, alongside with documenting the human rights atrocities, including the detention, torture, killing, the murdering and assassination of civilians who were kidnapped or taken as like by Shabiha and other groups who were working for the regime back then. The shooting, the murder of protesters. So all of that was keeping me extremely busy and totally involved in activism and in organizing these nonviolent activities. I was only one of hundreds of thousands of people, incredible people. Unfortunately, we lost many of them, whether in detention or under torture. And sadly, the only few of us who remain have no room now to do anything but just to keep telling the story. The situation evolved dramatically on the ground, and the need for humanitarian assistance and humanitarian work to whether to rescue the injuries and to offer medical support, medical response, and also we started having a lot of IDPs. So all of that put us also under extra responsibilities as nonviolent activists who were responsible for all of this together, including keep raising the awareness among our citizens and working with our people on the ground to assure them and to tell them about our dream and how we will find our dream one day. we also like started communicating with the political opposition. Back then was the Syrian National Council, to share with them our views and to negotiate on the political messages. It was part of the work to collaborate with people who were representing our our revolution abroad. And definitely, like when the armed group started, it was harder. It was harder to communicate. It was harder to mobilize, and also the atrocity. It was way harsher. That all of that led to me being detained, and after the first anniversary of the revolution, I was organizing across different cities, and I got arrested, and I was kept in Palestine branch. It's so funny that we have the security branch under the name of Palestine, but it's one of the worst ones in Syria and in the torture facilities. So yeah, after 6 months in detention and torture, I call it like enforced displacement, for sure, like an enforced disappearance. After that, I found myself like I was released, thanks for the international advocacy of international human rights defenders and my friends from Syria who were advocating for my freedom. I was released, and after a couple of months, I had to leave because also the regime started going after my family. So my father, my youngest brother, who was also minor, my youngest sister, who were arrested. My family got displaced, and when my sister was released, in exchange, a prisoner exchange deal between the armed groups and the regime, I had no choice but to leave the country, seeking medical care for her. Yeah, and I landed in Turkey, crossed the borders to Turkey in early January 2013.
Sounds like a deeply traumatizing time. Thank you for sharing that experience with us. It's really appreciated. Hosam, turning it over to you, what was your experience like between the time the conflict started, but before you joined the negotiating team?
Well, as I said, when the revolution erupted, igniting initially in Horan and Damascus, I was serving as a diplomat at the Syrian embassy in London. I was the head of the political section there. I remember those times when we heard the news as euphoric, marked by like sense of blessing, went through the streets of Damascus and other cities, demonstrations, rallies. The air was charged with energy of people and youth chanting for freedom, dreaming of a brighter future, even in the face of oppressive and brutal regime. In my mind at that time, there was like a dichotomy between hopeful aspirations of the masses and the ruthless nature of the ruling authority. That's created a tension that underscored the complexity of these historic moments. As you know, Syria history was always marked by political struggle since even before the independence. And the regime just made these problems more complex, eroding political rights and freedoms under the banner of pan-Arabism and under the banner of fighting the Western intervention, and also to keep supposedly the stability in the country. But this stability came at a very high price, leading to growing distrust and disappointment among the people who lived under the rule of a sole party system, Ba'ath-Party system. And after a short span of Damascus Spring, the regime turned again into security forces to deal with very complex issues, very complex aspects of life in Syria. Political forces were marginalized. The regime relied on the military and security forces with sectarian orientation sometimes. and things were moving from bad to worse. The tipping point was when the regime started killing the people in the demonstrations. There were hopes amongst the civil servants, the people from the government, that the regime would be a bit wise, or wise enough at least to respond to issues that the demonstrators were raising with wide political and economic reform. That would change the structure of the regime, the core of the regime. But however, the regime chose to hold on to power, no matter how expensive the cost of these policies. At that time, I was trying to send messages to develop some sort of rational discussion within the embassy and within the Syrian diplomatic corps, and I wrote anonymously some articles in Al-Quds Al-Arabi and other newspapers, but apparently that was not only fell into deaf ears, but also it incited the rage of the security apparatus against me as not loyal enough to the regime, or against me and against other fellow diplomats and fellow civil servants who try to make distinction between the regime and the state, between the regime and the government. I was one of many of my fellow civil servants who tried to go public and to say something about that. So many announced defection. We wanted to send the right messages to the regime and to the people of Syria, that the state and government belong to the people, not to the regime, and that after that I carefully observed the UN efforts, and I helped establishing legal framework for some very important portfolios legally, including the Kaiser, the Caesar file, before joining then the newly established team for negotiations at 2014.
Thank you, Hosam. Again, just such a different experience and how you experienced that time from Noura, but also very impactful. Hind, over to you. You joined the negotiation team a bit later, prior to Geneva 3. Describe your time between the time the conflict started and joining the negotiation team.
Yeah, thank you. I was actually in Damascus when this is all started at Umayyad Mosque, close to my home in the old city of Damascus. Used to since we are from the silent generation, I used to go and Friday to listen to the word of freedom, which was for me like a breath of fresh air. But being involved in the education, I had a direct contact with the civilian demonstrators, my own student, of course. So I did the split. I did see almost the split among the people from the beginning. The student and activist speaking about revolution, freedom, and democracy in one hand, and then from the government side talking about the civilian, when I say government, I mean the regime side, about the civilian movement, and it's an international conspiracy against Syria in the other hand. So it was all in the beginning civilian movement with beautiful people like Noura and her colleagues, but the regime reacted violently. And the first 3 months, actually, I was trying to be neutral and play the mediator role. I tried so hard with my friends and colleagues to pass the message to the regime and supporters that they should not use forces and to listen to the people's demands. I remember I used the slogan of Martin Luther King Jr., was our Silker of friends, who we all went in the same French school with Bashar al-Assad in Damascus. He said, in the end, we will remember not the word of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So I called each one of them to say, let's advise him not to use forces and to order his military intelligence not to kill and detain people, the civilians who are demonstrating, as Noura described, very peacefully. But of course, our mission failed. And he won't listen to anybody. And most of my friends are abroad now. So I started having a dialogue meetings in my house in the old city bringing people from all sides, trying to search for a common ground and try to agree in something. So the only things we agree in the end of March, in the end of April, that to sign a statement, we call it the milk statement, asking the regime to pass humanitarian aid and milk to the children of Daraa. But then on May 30, actually, 2011, I got an appointment to meet the president's wife. I went with four of my friends from different part of the society to visit al-Assad, to convince her that using forces against demonstrators and sieging Daraa, then was Daraa only, will end eventually to destroy our country. Again, we failed. So all this non-violence effort we tried to do to convince the regime not to use forces failed completely. So as Hosam said, there is a tipping point. So the tipping point was for me after 3 months when I saw the picture of the little child called Hamza al-Khatib. He's from Daraa, a little child, and he's a little child tortured to death. So I took the decision then that it is impossible to change a regime who can kill his own people and children. I left Syria and took the right side of the history, standing with my people who are demanding freedom and dignity. Thank you. The floor is yours. Back to you, Betsy.
Thank you, Hind. So the Geneva II peace negotiations officially started in 2014. Noura, can you start by telling us what were those negotiations like for you and for the negotiation team?
For me, I would say that I was somehow involved in working with Mr. Kofi Annan's team in preparation for the what we call the Geneva I, and we communicated a lot as activists on the ground with his team, helping in drafting the 6 points vision that he provided to the UN Security Council. So we were somehow involved in the preparation to that moment. And I remember when I arrived in Turkey and the discussions started again about like the UN Security Council would pass and now is discussing the resolution, and after the resolution was passed, so now it's time to for the opposition to frame the delegation and to get ready to prepare to participate in the negotiations. Many of my colleagues and friends on the ground were pushing me to get involved, and we had like, it was risky for me because back then my family was still in Syria. My youngest brother was in detention, and it was not an easy decision. And also like there was this international pressure on the Itilaf, on the political opposition, to call on new members to join. So it was the time when I had to take this very hard decision, whether to stay as a normal activist, maybe continue working in human rights as I started, trying to pursue a normal life, or to resume the life that destroyed by the regime after my detention, continue my academic studies, etc. Or I had to take this very hard decision to join the opposition and to be like trying to be part of the negotiations, carrying the trust, the wants, the dreams of youth in my country. And after like long nights, like long calls during the nights and so on, I said like, yeah, I would take that risk, especially that back then the opposition unfortunately didn't have enough women, only 2 or 3 women, and Yeah, I joined as the youngest member. We had this very tough experience also in making our voices heard. But what I believed in, similar to many of the activists on the ground and also in the exile, that we needed this negotiation truly to end the atrocity, to end the suffering of our people, to release detainees, and also to build a new democratic regime and to achieve the democratic transition that we went to the street in 2011 to create. That was the tipping point or the trigger for me to take this risk and to take that decision to join the opposition. When the opposition called on its members to vote, it was the chaos, unfortunately, back then, because we had this fragmentation between the members, and many of them were like whether skeptical, were not serious, or we had also 40 members who decided to withdraw from the opposition like a couple of days before the negotiation was officially about to start in Geneva. So it was a very tough moment and for everybody, and also like organizing the delegation and getting the paperwork. And I believe Hosam would talk more about the lack of preparation from the opposition side, because unfortunately it was not like the serious decision was made like to be made by the opposition back then, and it was the missing opportunity.
Thank you, Noura. Hosam, can you tell us more about your experience with the Geneva II negotiations that began in 2014?
Yes, sure. 2014, I was called upon to join the team. I was in Geneva at the time, working on the Caesar file. The negotiations at that time were brief, but intensive and very expressive. My observation was just quick observations. The Syrian opposition was largely unified. That was an advantage in comparison to other eras. The Syrian coalition received significant international support that was evidenced by the attendance of more than 40 or 42 countries at the diplomatic conference in Montreux that launched the negotiations. Those countries were mostly or all supporting the opposition, except for Russia, China, and of course the regime's delegation. The negotiations themselves were direct under the effective and intense supervision of the then international and Arab mediator, Al-Akhdar al-Ibrahimi. The two delegations were facing each other with the presence of the UN team, with a very clear document of modalities and technicalities of negotiations in place. I believe if given more opportunity, these negotiations could have achieved something much more significant for the Syrian people. However, despite the opposition's reasonable performance, the Syrian regime decided not to cooperate, and therefore the window was closed very immaturely. Yet also, I guess it's fair to admit also that the opposition's preparation was insufficient due to its non-initiative nature and lack of maybe the right political and legal expertise within it. That was combined by its internal problems and distrust, and what Noura described as hesitation to act and engage with the international community at the right time. If you remember, at 2012, at the time of Geneva Communique, the opposition who were gathered in Cairo refused to admit or to accept the Geneva Communique, which afterward became the Bible for the peace process. The opposition struggled to leverage also the substantial international support it received. Ultimately, it failed to sustain that initial wave of public and international backing. Of course, the international and external support was crucial, but it also gave rise to challenge the extensive and intense involvement of the international community in the opposition's decision-making process. And this interference led to conflicting directions as supporters pursued their own agendas and orientations. Maybe we can discuss that in another occasion. We can go deeper, but the regime pursued both his strategic and tactical objectives during the negotiations, utilizing Geneva as platform for his propaganda. And the UN flawed political process, it was lacking the mutually agreed upon agenda for negotiations. So that placed the opposition at a disadvantage. Therefore, the primary achievements of the opposition in Geneva 2014 lay in presenting themselves as acceptable to the international community. However, despite that, the way was not really paved for a solution at that time. But I believe that we missed a huge opportunity, because 2014, although we had thousands of martyrs and the wide destruction of the country, but things were escalated much more worse after 2014. Thank you. That's all.
Thanks, Hosam. I remember how disappointing it was for the peace talks to have ended that spring. And then, you know, everyone was hopeful that they would start up again soon, and they never did, at least until almost 2 years later in 2016. So the Geneva III peace talks started in 2016 and went into 2017. Noura, can you start by telling us about those?
Yeah, I think people started becoming hopeless, seeing any sooner end to the suffering, especially that when the peace talks in 2016 started, we already had the direct Russian invasion on Syria, and the war dynamics were totally different than 2014. The power or the balance in power between the civil society, the peaceful movement, and the armed groups was not that much in place as it was in 2014. However, there was a pattern between the two experiences, 2014, 2016, that first of all, we didn't have a partner in the room to negotiate with us. So we were playing solo and somehow. The other thing that the regime strategy was to do everything to push us to leave the negotiation and to say that we are no longer interested. So being in Geneva and being in the involving and working on the documents was not something pleasing the regime and the Russians back then, and I believe forever, because they were once we start the negotiation or we arrive in Geneva, the escalation would be harsher on the ground, more besieged areas, people wouldn't have any access to any food, and then the entire discourse of the negotiation would shift. The regime, I believe, in 2016 started bombing Aleppo, and more areas were under siege, and all of that was just tactics from the regime and the Russians to shift the discourse. Instead of we were there to negotiate on the peaceful democratic transition, they were trying to put us under the pressure from our own people to withdraw and to say that we reject to be in the same room while our people were being killed. And also it was a very hard decision to be made within the delegations themselves, because people, like, we were like two parts. Some people were in favor of the withdrawal and saying, like, we can't, like, the basic foundation of talking about peace is to have ceasefire, whereas ceasefire, unfortunately, was not feasible back then because of the regime tactics. And I believe, like, if our brothers and sisters in Ukraine would start any peace talks soon, sadly, the same tactics would be observed, which is really heartbreaking. But I believe when we realize that it's just a tactic to push us out of the peace talks, it's very important to address that and to respond accordingly. The third thing is the information warfare and the disinformation. It was flooding. And the main purpose of that was to separate the negotiator and the delegation from people on the ground, to create the status of mistrust between the delegation members themselves. And it was sadly, because the lack of awareness, before the 2016 elections in the US, the Russian disinformation and the Russian warfare was not a thing that was recognized globally as one of the warfare tactics that Russian and its allies were using in Syria and elsewhere. So these are the main three things that I just wanted to highlight. When we went to Geneva 2016, Geneva 3, the situation totally was different, including that we had a different UN resolution that somehow took some of our advantages from the 2014, including like the call for the establishment of a TGP, transitional governance body, and many other tactics that were translated also in like dividing the negotiations onto different levels and opening the floor for a lot of tricky games that the regime was trying to do. And everything was coming in somehow in favor, because the lack of international support in comparison between 2014 and 2016, the decline in the support, or like the Syrian cause was not that much an international cause that was the interest of many people, and also the direct involvement of the Russians, among many other things, were playing in the favor of the regime against us and against achieving any real democratic transition. My role back then was not as an official team member of the negotiation delegation. However, I was one of the advisors supporting our colleagues sitting in the room. So I will give the floor to Hosam and Hind, because they were more involved back then.
Thanks, Noura. And I also remember being there and having the increased regime attacks on civilians and how hard that was for your entire delegation. And I remember at one point, the decision was made to leave that round of peace talks because the attacks were so horrific. Hosam, can you tell us about your experience in the Geneva 3 peace talks, and maybe kind of how they differed from the Geneva 2 peace talks?
Yeah, negotiations in 2016 started in a changed international context, like Noura said, with less international support and continued diverse and conflicting interventions. The composition of the opposition was significantly changed as a result of Riyadh 1 conference, if you remember, introducing military factions with multiple and not necessarily harmonious representation into the delegation, into the HNC, as well as different political and civil society groups that were to some extent adversely affecting the decision-making process. And also, as Noura said, we had a new international reference, United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254 after the Vienna 2 declarations. So the international context was totally different. The negotiations did not reach the level of direct negotiations as 2014, and remain indirect proximity talks done through the international mediator, and the negotiation team were separated in different chambers all along. The opposition preparation for the negotiations was better than 2014. Important documents exchanged between the parties. However, the international mediator was unsuccessful in reaching understanding through these documents. The international mediator and most of the international parties, in fact, tried to pressurize the weaker side, which is the opposition. They were in the opposition side, they were like ups and downs in performance, with a presence of specific individuals in the negotiating body being a disadvantageous factor in reaching the necessary understandings within the team, within the opposition, and in accordance with its political references. On the other hand, the regime's delegation was committed not to present any positive ideas and not to cooperate to advance the negotiations, and was only engaged in some very well studied respects without aiming to achieve anything. The military situations, as Noura said, and as you said, Betsy, changed after the Russian direct entry into the war, and the military escalation coincided most of the time with the negotiation rounds, significantly affected the atmosphere, continuously straining it and reducing the opposition self-confidence. The opposition delegation was always criticized from its own audience, from its own people, because the opposition could not exert military pressure to achieve negotiation objectives for, maybe for complex reasons that can't be fully discussed now. But despite this, I can say that during 2016-17 negotiations, there were also proper windows for beneficial breakthroughs and finding a path to a Syrian settlement. However, the negotiation failed to capitalize on these opportunities. At the end of the negotiations, the process was entirely reoriented, replacing the negotiating opposition with more pressure compliant one. Despite all of this, the time had run out for this opportunity, I guess, and the opposition, represented now by the Syrian Negotiation Commission and the Syrian National Coalition, entered the Syrian issue into a non-negotiatory path. Maybe there's now, as everybody witnessed, freezing in the political solution for maybe four years so far. So we don't have the same medium that we used to have in 2016-17 in Geneva, as two teams, two negotiating delegations negotiated under the auspices of the United Nations and within the framework of United Nations Security Council resolutions. Thank you. Back to you, Betsy.
Thank you, Hosam. Hind, the Geneva 3 peace talks were your first kind of entree into the peace negotiations. Can you tell us about your experience in those talks in 2016 and 2017?
Sure. I'm not going to repeat what my colleague Hosam and my colleague Noura said, because already been said, but I just want to start like when I got elected to be a member of the High Negotiation Commission 7 years ago. I remember, Betsy, I asked myself the same night, what shall I do something different to find a peaceful solution for Syria? And how can I make a difference and save lives? This is immediately the questions. From the beginning, I can see that political negotiation is completely different from business negotiation, because the context of the political negotiation is involving representatives of nation, regional power, international players, and the goal is focus on broader long-term aims. In our Syrian case, our goal to have democratic country, to negotiate with other party who represent a dictator is supported by countries like Iran and Russia. So imagine how difficult it is. As you see, like what my colleague Hosam said, there is no direct negotiation. The regime was refusing even to deal with anything. So for the 8th round, he's refusing to come to the table. And, you know, we all know that you need two to tango. There is nobody to tango with. And the mediator here, I have to give a little bit of credit. The mediator then, Stefan de Mistura, was trying to constantly find alternatives, options, and new ideas, like any good mediator will do, because the first first lesson, actually, we need to deal with, I have few lessons learned to deal with the emotion, was in the negotiation, especially if you are negotiating with other side who are bombing the civilian and starving your own people. Then you have to deal with the social media. And I remember Hosam and Noura knows very well how, in this case, in the eyes of the public, the negotiators are traitors because you are negotiating with the enemy. We constantly need to explain that war cannot end without a political solution at the table. So it's been very hard to deal with this all negative hate social media. Then the third one, you have to deal constantly with the spoilers. And the spoilers can be from all sides, even from your own team. Of course, the regime was the biggest spoiler because he didn't want all the negotiation. But also from your own team, and as Hosam said, that people, they don't want to negotiate, they're under pressure, the Russian is bombing, we're withdrawing. So this is, and also, of course, we all know the Lord of Wars and other politicians who have interests of the war to continue. So they put always those obstacles around us. Then I can see that there's number 4 lesson I learned, that the geopolitics is playing a big role in the Syrian conflict. So the enemy of today can be your friend tomorrow and vice versa. So you just have to imagine that here people are sitting and there is a negotiation table, and then it is supposed to be the Syrian-led process, but influenced and surrounded by regional and international stakeholders, visible or invisible, directly or indirectly, and sometimes behind the closed doors. So this is exactly the way we have to deal with. Then inclusivity. Exactly Hosam described it. There is no harmony within our team. And you know very well the magic word in any peace process, it's inclusivity. And because of we are a mosaic country, and the Syrian process, it's involved in a way, it's a complex, multi-faceted issues with various stakeholders, and can be highly sensitive due to historical, culture, or ideological factors, which we can't now talk about it, like we got the Kurdish issues, we got the ideological party, so it's been very hard. So in a way, an example, if we need always to be sensitive, involving everybody within our team, we're still with our team because we didn't negotiate yet with the others. So we have to be very careful and try to include everybody. Then number 5 is important to involve in any negotiation, the whole tracks in the process, track 1, 2, or 3. And really, we can't have sustainable peace without involving all. So this is also a big problem because you have to convince the track 1 that it is important to involve everybody from other tracks in this. So usually in negotiation part, you need the communication, bargaining, and compromise between us. But it is always we have to start negotiating between us. For example, I have to give you, and Betsy was involved with us with this, with the vision of 2016. And first of all, we have to have our own vision. Then we need to, and we have to convince our colleagues that it is important to bring the NGO, civil society, and consult as much as we can from other Syrian organizations, women group, religious leader, youth, to get their feedback. So it's been very hard for us to convince our colleague that it is important to bring everybody. Then we got the issue of the women, because we have to convince everybody the importance of the role of women at the negotiation table. So we were only 4 in the negotiation team. Since we could not increase the number, we decided to have kind of diverse women consulting team. And of course, the great Noura was among us, and she got all those great ideas. And it wasn't easy also to convince those track 1 politicians, men in suit, and our group that include women group and civil society at the table. It's a priority. And remember, Hosam was very good supporter in this. And remember that we did lots of work to get this women consulting group in place. So while we were in Geneva, as Hosam and Noura said, there is no negotiation, and we were already there. So we thought the best way to start, let's take advantage of us being there. So we did so many events, including many people from other civil society. We talked about the siege of Ghouta then, we got the Daraya, we have the bomb of Aleppo, we have the detainees files. While we're doing all this, there is the Russian attacks in Idlib, and of course the refugee and the forced displaced problem. And meanwhile, Astana talk, and by the end of the 8th round, we're in Vienna, when they pronounced the meeting of Sochi, and the outcome of this meeting was proclaimed the Constitution Committee. And I will stop here, and if you want me later to speak about our Geneva work, Betsy, let me know. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Hind. I do remember how impressive your efforts were to include women and civil society actors, and kind of the interface, the track 2 and 3 negotiation work that was going on with the track 1 process. So this is my final question for all of you. What lessons did you draw from your involvement in the peace process, Noura? And what have you been involved with since 2017?
Wow, this is really hard. For me, like saying, as Hind described perfectly, seeing everything collapsed, I lost hope, similar to many people. And I decided to step down from the opposition and leave everything. Because if we can't help in bringing peace and achieve the democratic transition that we dreamed of since 2011, maybe for me, it's better to invest in my own education, work with civil society and with women in the ground. I'm still active through Start Point as a civil society organization. We work with women, we work with defenders and with youth. But in terms of seeking peace, whereas there are no partners and there's no serious work on the international side, it's really hard to stay hanging on there. So I left, and for now I'm working on different projects with women on the ground, with defenders and young people in Syria and in exile. And professionally, I'm studying the digital atrocities against defenders, whether at home or in exile, the systematic digital attacks that authoritarian regimes are launching against women peacemakers and women defenders, both in exile and in their home countries. The lessons I learned that no matter where we are, but we can have our own influence to help. And sadly, once the war starts, it's not easy to think about very short-term solution. And as I said before, that working with communities and working with people on the ground is the main foundation of making and creating the sustainable long-term solution and peace for today and for the future and for the very long-term future. Even if we today manage to sign the best peace agreement and all parties, this is like the sunshine unicorn dream, that the regime agreed with us to sign this, like, let's have new TGP and let's have the best democratic country and let's adopt the best constitution in the world, without working with our own people to make this peace feasible. We can't. This is why, unfortunately, in many peace talks, the role of women and civil society groups is really absent. And without them, honestly, like, there's no feasible peace or long-term solution. So this is my number one solution or learning lesson, that having women's voices, not only as statistics, because unfortunately we stuck into that. The diversity and inclusion is the essential solution. It's not about having people like, let's have 3 courts, let's have 2 Sunnis and 3 women, and we have the best peace. If the experiences of those people and the voices of those people wouldn't be amplified and influencing the process, it means that their participation is useless, and it's just the statistics, maybe to satisfy some actors who don't think beyond statistics. Youth are definitely the essential key player in all of this. They are the future, and without working with youth, protecting them from becoming hopeless, from being radicalized, from losing hope in having or finding a room to build their own country, there is nothing to be achieved. And as I mentioned earlier, the disinformation is something that sadly we failed in as Syrian peacemakers to address and to deal with, but hopefully we can learn this lesson and build on it, because now getting the chance to reflect and to reread through everything was published against us or to disturb the peace talks back then, 2014 and 2016, I can see the patterns, and I can see that sadly we failed because we didn't know, but now we know. Maybe it's our chance also to counter this disinformation and to stay strong, united, and to talk to each other about it, because we can't survive countering the Russian disinformation and the regime disinformation and all of these tactics without being united and without being together. Yeah, the final thought is definitely every war needs to be ended on negotiation table, and we negotiate with our enemies, we don't negotiate with friends. Thank you.
Thank you, Noura. Thank you very much. Hosam, next to you, what lessons did you learn and what have you been up to since 2017?
I would start by some observations. I would say that negotiations are demanding and lengthy processes that requires complex calculations, but starting them as soon as possible should be a goal by itself. This is a lesson for all nations, I guess. The sooner you start serious negotiations, the better for the whole cause and the whole to have an end for internal or international wars. Secondly, creating coherent delegations with the highest degree of competence is a significant requirement for a successful negotiation. It's essential also in my mind, this is my view, it's essential to differentiate popular forces as civil society representatives from political negotiations, which should be conducted by politically skilled and professionally competent negotiators. Of course, I would add that having a track 2 is always a good idea, but it should be taken with utmost caution specifically when reaching the negotiation summaries by the mediator. And also, negotiators need clear mandate from their people with clear terms of reference. The line of negotiations for each party should be measured against these terms of reference, this line of negotiations. Additionally, serious preparations for negotiations and decision-making processes can provide better chances for a successful process. It's also crucial to be aware of the many interventions that could be seen in negotiation processes, especially from friends and allies, as their conflicting orientations can confuse and disrupt the decision-making process within the team. And it's the negotiation interests for friends and allies are not identical, and that they differ from those of the negotiating party, and thus the goals could be entirely different. This should be remembered at every stage of negotiation. And it's also important to have a timely response to the windows that might be opened for a political opportunity, a political track. The hesitation might cost the hesitant party dearly. It's vital to adhere to a serious negotiation route at all costs and not miss any opportunity to achieve gradual and accumulative negotiation results. As for me, Betsy, I kept working in the field of law. I'm a legal consultant and I do negotiation training. Academically, I lecture in public international law, international organizations, and because I have PhD in international human rights law, I do also training and lecturing in international human rights law and humanitarian law. I'm also a chair of a non-governmental organization called the Syrian Council for International Relations that it's having members from different civil service defected from the Syrian regime back in 2012 onward, and we have expertise in other state institutions in Syria as well. Thank you. Back to you, Betsy.
Thanks, Hosam. And I remember, because we were providing pro bono advice, including on the legal aspect, we worked closely together over that time, and it was a pleasure. Hind, now over to you. What lessons did you learn from the peace talks in 2016 and 2017? And, what have you been doing since then?
I don't want to repeat. This is the beauty of being the third one. So many things will be covered, so you don't have to repeat it again. But I do agree that we need to start negotiation immediately. And we have to do everything and anything to not to withdraw, because people think that this is our tactic. We do it like let's withdraw. No, you can't withdraw. This is negotiation, and the minute it's blocked, the negotiation blocked, it will be very hard to return to the negotiation table. We have to have a thick skin. We have to be prepared. We have to be as a team working together, and not to think about who's who and whose background is. We're team. And from the beginning, I always thought that we are team, and doesn't matter if we are coming from different places or different background, but we're here together now. And we're here to serve the people. And we need to be a servant to those people. I know many politicians, they don't like this word servant leader, but we do insist. And I do believe that having track 6, like track 1 plus 2 and 3 together at the table, it showed a lot of benefits in other countries. And I do believe that this is very important. We can't keep it to the politicians. We have to get people from everybody to be at the table. And I spent 5 years in Geneva in the office and been appointed. I've been appointed by after my survey. I finished my time in the high negotiation. So I've been appointed to be the deputy ambassador for a wonderful ambassador, Dabbar, who's a real diplomat and real career diplomat. And we did recognize all those challenges. We recognize the political environment, and we want to serve the people. So we did open many files, and this is exactly what I want to say, that lesson learned. If they are closing the door, you just get to the window, and you have to keep this process alive. So we've been dealing with the sanction, with multi-tracks dialogue among Syria, especially when it's come to the social contract. And we did help lots with the humanitarian file. Now Mark will talk more about it, how important it is to keep those border. And we couldn't do it, of course, without the help of the grassroots and track 2 and 3. And I remember one day when we did a big event to keep those borders open. And this is where we ask our women groups on the ground in Azaz and Idlib to help us with the recommendations. And I remember we did this event, bringing people from inside to be on Zoom with us and talk about the importance of opening those borders. And remember very well that I sent all the recommendation to everybody, like international community. And one of my colleagues from the humanitarian sectors, a very good friend of Mark, she said that the Russian came and showed her those recommendations and asked her who did this. And she told them, this is the woman in Idlib and in Azaz. This is what show you that how deep those women are thinking, and this is why we should always include them in our conversation. So after 5 years, I give my resignation, and I have all the respect to all the members of the negotiation and the opposition team. But now I'm concentrated. I'm full-time working with my George Mason University, and we did a special program with conflict resolution and mediation. So we got now 1,800 Syrian women and youth graduated from this program, and sometimes I have to share that. Sometimes I get really frustrated and upset and sad, and I feel like I don't want to wake up. I don't want to leave my bed. But then I think about those women and youth in Syria who wants to learn. They want to become the future of Syria. So this is, I have one reason not to get up, but 1,000 reasons to get up because of those students. I've been going to Azaz and Afrin frequently to teach, and I can see, like what Noura said, the future are the youth, and this is important for us to believe in them. And what I want, always I say, I've been fortunate to serve my people for all those years. It's time now for me to share my experience and to teach. So part of the leadership, you have to teach next generation about the mistakes, about lesson learned, about what can we do in the future. Before I finish, I remember what we did see in Ukraine. It's the same things we did see in Idlib. Russian bombing and the war being silenced. And then the Ukraine. And I remember the women, we had a Women's Day celebration. The women in Azaz, the first thing they say, our heart goes to the Ukrainian, because we've been through what they're happening now to them. So this is the beauty and the power we can get from women on the ground, and lesson learned, include everybody. And if you don't negotiate anymore, teach others. And the teaching circle is so important, because I know I can sleep well now, because I know somebody, somehow, somewhere, the Syrian women and youth, they will continue our struggle. Thank you. Back to you, Betsy.
Thank you so much, Hind. Mark, I'd like to draw you into the conversation now. You worked at the US State Department during this time, and you were engaged in negotiations with Russia on both a ceasefire and humanitarian access. Can you tell us a little bit about those negotiations? And then I know you also have a question to share with our panelists.
Sure, Betsy. Nice to see you again. Nice to work with you again. And Hosam, Noura, and Hind, all I can say is you inspired me then, and what you're up to these days continues to inspire me. So thanks very much to all of you for not giving up. Yeah, so while all of this was going on, the negotiations with the regime in Geneva, the US was engaged in an effort to try to use the leverage that we had over the opposition and the leverage that Russia had over the regime to improve humanitarian access inside Syria and bring about some ceasefires which go along with humanitarian access. And this was the brainchild of then Secretary Kerry, and a relationship I never really knew how to characterize it that he thought he had with Sergei Lavrov. And so the two of them cooked up this idea of two task forces. I co-chaired one of them. One of the task forces to improve humanitarian access inside Syria, and one of them to try to negotiate ceasefires. And I would say, and this is what I'm going to ask the other panelists about, for 6 to 8 months, given that we were coming out of a period of horrible humanitarian access, where towns, where communities were basically being starved into surrender to the regime, and ceasefires were a joke. You heard the other panelists talking about the bombing of civilian areas that was going on. There was a period, I would say 6 to 8 months, where we actually saw remarkable success from the low point in 14 and 15 of basically no access and terrible casualties, to a period in 2016 where we had this task force trying to put leverage on the two sides to improve humanitarian access, was quite successful. And an occasional ceasefire. I would say less success when it came to ceasefires, but occasional success. And then what happened? My diagnosis looking back is that as it became more and more of a threat to the regime's strategy of starving communities into submission, it started to push back when Russia put pressure on them to allow humanitarian access or go along with a ceasefire. And we started to see sometime in late 2016, I would say, the regime starting to say no again when the UN asked for permission to deliver aid to a particular location inside Syria. And I would, as the representative on the US side, jump up and down, huff and puff, and yell at the Russians, why aren't you doing more to keep your clients in line? They agreed before, why are they disagreeing now? And what became apparent to me over time was that the regime had figured out that Russia was really not going to use any leverage to enforce access or enforce a ceasefire. The Russian ambassador in Damascus would probably yell at the regime. He would probably demand that they comply. But so what? What became apparent is that Russia was not going to use the real leverage that it had, basically security assistance, military. It was not going to use that leverage to try to get wins on humanitarian access or ceasefires. And eventually the regime figured that out. And they were very used to getting yelled at. My goodness, the regime was, everybody in the world was yelling at the regime. So having the Russians yell at it didn't cost them much. It goes in one ear and out the other. And so slowly we began to see the success that we'd had in gaining access and putting ceasefires in place fall apart, to the point where this exercise of trying to negotiate access and ceasefires became a bit of a waste of time. So that was my sort of diagnosis. And my question to the panelists is simply, so you were all aware of this. I remember part of my job was to keep you informed in Geneva what we were up to and how these negotiations were going. What was your impression of it at the time? And don't worry, you won't hurt my feelings if you say, Mark, it was silly, it was a waste of everybody's time. Tell me what you really thought then, and looking back, what you might think now in terms of what the U.S. was trying to do as you pursued peace discussions, what we were trying to do to try to improve the situation on the ground inside Syria. Over to you.
Okay, I will go first.
Briefly.
Oh, go ahead, Hosam,
Okay,
please.
Noura, go.
Yeah, what I can say that in terms of if I want to reflect on that period, first of all, definitely civilians under siege, getting access to humanitarian aid and enjoy ceasefire was not something in favor of the regime, because it was very obvious to the regime that once the bombardment would stop or freeze at least, and people can take or get access to their basic livelihoods, protests start again. The activities of local councils and civil society were resumed, and less authority to the armed groups on the ground was, because like once we don't have any fight anymore, so now it's time for the civil society to step in and to take a lead and to bring people back again on track of the essentials and foundations of the idea of the revolution in the first place. So we agree on this point. The thing that I believe the US didn't recognize two essential things. First of all, the elephant in the room, who had more influence on the regime than the Russians, was the Iranians. The Iranians had more influence, and I believe until today. And also the Iranians were acting strategically on the ground in terms of running and leading their own siege in specific strategic places for them, and enforcing the siege on specific areas, and also negotiating over the forced displacement with some armed groups in certain areas. And I believe the latest example to that was Daraya, because all the efforts to deliver humanitarian aid and break the siege partially in Daraya to help people to stay there failed, unfortunately. And that was because of the influence of the Iranians. And even like through some indirect channels, I was negotiating on Daraya in particular with the Russians. And they said, like, we can't do anything because the Iranians are involved there and we can't help. Because if you remember, Mark and my other colleagues, the model of even like the Russian negotiation with some besieged areas in Homs and Damascus was to keep some of the civilians and displace the fighters or people who don't want to negotiate or to have peace. But the Iranian model of the forced displacement was like, let's put all of them in buses and displace them to the north. So we succeeded in some places, but unfortunately in these very hard to reach places, and where Iran was, first of all, Iran was out of the discussions. And secondly, Iran was blocking the area and manipulating even the decision until to the level that even the regime, I believe, had no control over that. And now we are seeing what one of the brilliant Syrian academics called the democide, that was a systematic forced displacement and ethnic cleansing to civilians from these certain areas, where now the Iranian companies are working to re-innovate and reestablish their own businesses over there. So even the regime has less role to play in this moment. So I believe that point was really missing from the discourse and negotiation with the Russian, because also we all and somehow overestimated the Russian influence on the region.
Just a quick reminder to everyone, we have 6 minutes left.
Just a quick observation or reflecting what Mark said. as Noura said, the regime had the chance always to dispose the pressure that came from the Russians by utilizing and using the Iranians militias on the ground. And the Russians also shared, I don't believe that there was enough pressure anyway from the Russians, because they shared the narration of the regime that these besieged area were containing all terrorists, and they starving terrorists is not a crime. And they were repeatedly saying that, and also sharing the other argument that the opposition and fighting groups are taking civilians as hostages and as human shields, and all this false narration. I guess, but the problem was or started by, I guess, the concept of Lavrov-Kerry agreement, that we can bring the two parties to negotiations with a very wide and broad lines of agenda, reaching, or we want them to reach a constitution and election framework, and that's enough without exerting enough pressure on both sides, particularly the regime side, of course. And the regime understood that game quite well from the beginning. So they used the Astana process, and before that, the humanitarian track to leverage and to calculate, to work out their political presence in Geneva, and doing some incentives to the Russians and to the Americans by adhering to some agreements on the humanitarian side, without achieving anything on political track, on achieving any kind of political agreement. That was all along the game of the regime, and that's why we ended up having no political track and no political real negotiations now, with no light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think I still have like 1 minute, right, Betsy? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So first of all, Mark, all your effort was very highly appreciated. I remember the last day you left, you brought your colleagues. And since then, we've been working with all your replacement. I know that you fight, and you fought, and you're still fighting in the humanitarian task force for the Syrian humanitarian aids. I know in every time we have to go, they have a vote for this. You've been trying your best. But I can tell you my experience with the Russian, and I met them several times in Geneva, and I went for a delegation to Moscow, then in New York. It is exactly what Hosam say. It is always the negotiation is between, for them, the secular and modern Assad regime, and calling us jihadi and extremist. As I remember, one of the officials in New York called me to tell me why you are here defending the radical Islam. And I have to answer gently that the Christians in Syria are indigenous people and not to newcomers. And we always led in national causes and movement. And you cannot, and we are together with everybody in this conflict. And safety for our Muslim colleagues are the same as our safety. So this is always that for him, it's Bashar is defending minority, the others are radicals. And this is the problem now. We can see that many people are getting to know that, no, it's not, especially now after the Sueda movement. They can see now the Jews and the minority are racing against the regime. So this is a good lesson to the Russian that no, he's not a minority defender. He is the one, he put Christian, Muslim, Alawite, all of them in prison if they are opposing him. So lesson learned, Mark, thank you for your effort. We know that the only problem, I know many people, they don't know the amount of humanitarian aids you're giving. So because always you do it through other international organizations. And many times we have to, when people say, oh, look at the American, they're not doing anything, they are. And we know that the majority of the money coming for the humanitarian aids coming from the American, and we hope this will continue. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, and a tremendous thanks to Noura, Hosam, and Hind for sharing with us the lessons you learned firsthand in negotiations. I want to say on behalf of everyone at the Human Rights Center, all of our co-sponsors, and I'm sure everyone in this meeting, that we wish all the best for the Syrian people.
Thank you for
Very much.
having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.